This week we're moving on to the second unit of the course, poetry. Some of you might have a great deal of experience reading poetry. For others, this might be entirely new. If that's the case, you'll need to adopt different reading strategies than those you use when reading prose. I've posted a quick guide in your modules to help with this. There's also a video linked on the page that you should watch. Often when we think of poetry, we think of Shakespeare's sonnets or an inspirational poem by someone like Robert Frost. This, though, is just one type of poetry called lyric poetry. Lyric poetry is what you probably think of when you imagine a poem. A shorter text that expresses the thoughts or emotions of the speaker and usually has a set form or rhythm. It dates back to the earliest examples of writing and is featured as part of the literary development in most cultures. It can be distinguished from dramatic and narrative poetry. Narrative poetry is a poem that tells a story and is one of the earliest kinds of literature. Classic texts like Beowulf and the Odyssey are narrative poems. Dramatic poetry presents a scene in spoken form, sometimes as a monologue with one speaker and sometimes as a dialogue. You'll see clear characters and a plot in both narrative and dramatic poetry, much like you would find in fiction. Reading lyric poetry, though, is a bit different from reading prose text or even narrative poetry. The meaning is often more difficult to determine because the language is much more minimal, and the writers rely significantly on imagery, symbolism, and even the sound and rhythm of the poem to bring across the meaning. They also often adopt personas, so even when it may seem like the poem expresses the author's emotion, there is a different, unnamed speaker or alternative viewpoint being explored. In order to understand how the poetry is working, it's important to be familiar with some specific techniques that the authors may be using. One significant way that poets communicate is through the use of literary devices, such as metonymy, alliteration, and assonance. Metonymy is the use of the name of one thing for something closely related. For example, saying the head to represent reason or the heart to represent emotion. This type of metaphor allows the author to use a visual, concrete object to stand for a much more abstract element. Alliteration is a literary device that uses the repetition of consonants, usually at the beginning of the word, to create a stylistic effect in writing. For example, in Poe's The Raven, he says, "The silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain." This repeated S sound creates the impression of the rustling curtains within the language itself. Similarly, assonance is a literary device that uses the repetition of vowels, usually at the beginning of the word, to create a stylistic effect in writing. Again from Poe. "Thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now to still the beating of my heart I stood repeating, 'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, this it is and nothing more." Both of these techniques allow the writer to use not just the meaning of the language, but its actual sound to communicate the feelings that they are expressing through the poem. Authors might also use the form of the poem to further their message or theme. When discussing the form of the poem, there are some basic terms that are helpful to know. And as always, these terms are in your course glossary if you need to review them later. First, syntax is the way in which words are ordered to create clauses, phrases, and sentences. A stanza is the group of lines in a poem set off from the others, basically a poetic paragraph. The repetition of the first stressed vowel sound in poetry is rhyme. Rhythm is the beat of the poem created by the stressed and unstressed syllables. Foot is the smallest repeated unit of rhythmic poetry in a poem. Finally, meter is the pattern formed when these lines of the poem follow a recurrent rhythm. So, for example, when you read Shakespeare, he used iambic pentameter. An iamb is a foot that has the specific pattern of an unaccented and short syllable, followed by a long and accented syllable. Ba-bum, kind of like a heartbeat. Penta means 5, so pentameter is a 5-part meter. Put it all together, and you get 5 ba-bums. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's leaf hath all too short a date. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum." Finally, authors might play with the connotation and denotation of words to bring their meaning across. Denotation is the unambiguous dictionary definition of words. Connotation is the emotional weight or social baggage a word brings that colors the way we use or understand it. For example, even though they have the same denotation, dictionary meaning, the connotations of a cottage in the forest is different than a cabin in the woods. Pocket dial is very different than booty call. All of these elements give poetry great potential for expression, but they can also make them difficult for a reader to sort through. So if you find it challenging, don't give up. This week's readings will cover some major elements of poetry: speaker, setting, tone, and theme, language, and imagery. Rather than focusing on specific authors, therefore, you'll be introduced to a lot of poems from various writers and time periods. Even though the poems aren't labeled according to the literary periods, they still belong to them. See if you can't tell the modernists from the romantics. As always, remember your discussion board and reading journal. Your first writing project is due next week as well. It's worth 20% of your final grade, so give it time and attention it's need. You need to get a draft to the tutoring center or to appear to review it this week, and you need to have your feedback back by Sunday, so plan ahead. Let me know if you need help, and happy reading.